Before I begin the second of my 3 lectures, permit me to once again thank the Swedenborg Society for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm particularly grateful to Executive Director Stephen McNeely, Editor James Wilson, and Avery Curran, the Society's Events Coordinator. To these 3 and to the rest of the staff, I'm sincerely grateful for keeping a retired academic busy. As you know from my first lecture, I explained that while I'm a great admirer of Swedenborg, I am not a follower. Neither am I a homeopath. What I am is a historian who employs the tools of his craft to provide what I hope is an honest accounting of these 2 historical movements, which are not only interesting in their own right, but as I will attempt to explain over the next 40 minutes or so, how they are also so closely entwined. A good part of the satisfaction that I have as a historian is the challenge to explain the context in which people like Swedenborg and like Samuel Hahnemann, the founder of homeopathy, how they developed their ideas. What was it that led them to think in the manner they did? How did their generation see and interpret the world? What principles did they believe in prior to drawing up their theories? Or, as the philosopher Thomas Kuhn would ask, what worldview or perceptual set of beliefs colored their minds as they formulated their theories? In looking at homeopathy's journey into Swedenborgianism, we need to begin by asking just what is homeopathy? Now, homeopathy is based on principles laid down by its founder, Samuel Hahnemann, who lived between the years 1755 and 1843. He was a German physician who eventually took his theory to Paris, where he practiced and where he refined his particular approach to healing. Over time, his principles became the basis of homeopathic healing and have remained so ever since. The first 3 of his principles seem to me to be the most important, and therefore I intend to focus on them alone rather than draw you into his other principles. The first of his principle was that of similia similibus curantur, meaning like cures like. Now, without going into the details of how he discovered this law, he concluded that a drug which has the power of producing the symptoms of a disease in a healthy person would relieve those same symptoms if given to a sick person. In other words, any drug that is capable of creating detrimental symptoms of a disease, such as malaria, if taken by a healthy person, will relieve those similar symptoms in someone diagnosed with the actual disease of malaria. Hahnemann's second principle was to prescribe no more than a single small dose of a single drug at any one time. Given the practice of polypharmacy and heroic medications which were popular in the day, it is little wonder that a small dose of a single drug produced improved outcomes. But Hahnemann didn't stop there, but quickly moved from small doses of a single drug to infinitesimal dosage and eventually to the point where there was literally no longer even a molecule of the drug remaining in the solution. This led to his third principle, namely that drugs which acted according to the law of similia similibus curantur and reduced to infinitesimal levels acted through a medium other than matter. And that's important. Acted in a medium other than matter. What this implied was that when a drug was attenuated or diluted, it was stripped of its material elements, whereupon the drug's immaterial or spiritual qualities were unleashed to stimulate the body's own recuperative powers. Thus, even though the material presence of a medicine was reduced to the point where nothing remained of its material presence, the patient could be strongly influenced by the drug's immaterial powers. Now, the question we want to ask ourselves is, how is this possible? Does it not violate the laws of science as we know them? Now, Hahnemann concluded that the answer lay in the manner in which the drug was prepared, which he called potentization or dynamization. Hahnemann reasoned that with proper shaking, or what he called succussion, medicines acquired inherent virtues that changed crude substances into spiritually dynamized agents. Doses that were scarcely thought to be material because of their highly diluted state could still exert an enormous effect on a patient. So, let's be clear. Hahnemann made a distinction between a normal solution, which consisted of adding water to a medicinal substance until it lost its power, and a dynamization in which, due to succussion, caused the immaterial powers in the crude substance to be set free to act upon a specific disease. Hahnemann even warned that excessive shaking of a medicinal substance could sometimes make it too dangerous to use. Hahnemann regarded these three principles as occupying the high ground of common sense against what he perceived were the quixotic extremes of old-school rationalism. As you can imagine, these views jarred against an 18th and 19th century culture that expected its medicines to produce a forceful effect upon the body in order to confirm its healing powers. If a medicine neither purged, puked, blistered, sweated, or salivated, physicians and patients alike questioned whether the medicine provided any benefit at all. In large measure, these three principles served as a welcome change in medical therapeutics and explains why homeopathy appealed to so many individuals and families. So the question I want to ask is, where did this idea of Hahnemann come from? Did he create it out of thin air, or did he borrow it from some other source? Like many others in his day, Hahnemann had a fascination with the work of Anton Mesmer, who himself was a German doctor who theorized the existence of a natural energy which he called animal magnetism. Mesmer, who had preceded Hahnemann to Paris by about a generation, had the notion that all bodies, from inanimate objects to people and planets, existed under the influence of an invisible but universal fluid that filled the universe and connected all things. It was this medium through which light, heat, and electricity traveled from one object to another. And he called this energy animal magnetism. He also explained that this fluid or animal magnetism required an even distribution, meaning that a free flow or blockage of this magnitude could cause a disruption in the universe. And for humans, such blockages could make the difference between health and disease. Mesmer and his disciples, of which there were many in both the United States and Europe, claimed the ability to cure disease by adjusting the amount of magnetism in and around the body. Mesmer's method of cure was to gently move his hands, or sometimes a wand, around a patient in order to ensure a more balanced and distributed set of forces. So how different was this from Hahnemann's principle of small, if not infinitesimal, doses of medicine? We can see that both men were moving away from conventional medicine by seeking not to deplete the body of its fluids by bleeding, purging, leeches, blistering, or other similar methods, but rather seeking something else. Did Hahnemann read Mesmer? Do we know that? Yes, he did. We know it from reading Hahnemann's Organon, in which he took note of Mesmer's energy field, explaining that men who were magnetizers, who had an abundance of vital energy, could communicate to a patient using only touch, sharing his vital energy to compensate for the depleted energy or misplaced energy in the sick individual. Could it be that the homeopath who succussed or shook a vial of medicine transferred his own vital energy or magnetism into the bottle? Rather than dynamization by way of succussion, some believe that the homeopath could transfer his own excess energy into the solution, and that's what made it so powerful. Although Hahnemann chose not to make a direct connection between his non-materialist medicine and magnetism, as he slowly passed his hands over the body of the patient, he clearly saw a relationship between his principle of potentization and the energy field postulated by Mesmer. I believe that Hahnemann was one of many in his day who developed a variation of healing around Mesmer's ideas. And like the others, this energy source, which supposedly filled the ether, irrevocably separated Hahnemann's healing system from old world medicine. The process or modus operandi, however, remained confused and entangled. And Hahnemann's followers were in endless discussions, differences, and feuds over the decades as to how this happened. History will show that long after Hahnemann's death, the modus operandi, or the explanation for how dynamization actually worked, remained unsolved, and in fact, even today, homeopaths have yet to satisfactorily explain how this works. Is it really the succussion or shaking that dynamized the medicine? Was it the transfer of the healer's excess magnetism to the solution? Or was there another explanation for how the dilutions worked? After Mesmer's influence waned, homeopaths began looking for other explanations to explain what happened during dynamization. During the 1940s, for example, homeopaths suggested a relationship between atomic energy and the remedial power of potentized drugs. In other words, the drug atoms smashed during the succussion process, causing some small form of atomic fusion. Later in the 1960s, homeopaths focused on water memory, arguing that when a substance is diluted in pure water, the water retains the memory of the drug's molecular structure, despite its disappearance when highly diluted. In other words, it was not the material substance that produced the healing effect, but the formative force of energy it carried. Of course, there were critics as well, who argued that what was really happening was nothing more than a form of psychotherapy, and others who simply said it was the placebo effect. But let's get back to the generation of Hahnemann and see what other theories were put forth at that time. The simple fact is that we cannot view Mesmer's animal magnetism as the only explanation for how Hahnemann's remedies worked. And that is because many of Hahnemann's ideas ran parallel with the religious thinking of the scientist and mystic Emanuel Swedenborg. Unlike Mesmer, however, there is no evidence that Hahnemann read any of Swedenborg's writings. But this was not the case for Hahnemann's followers, who not only referenced Swedenborg's teachings, but openly embraced Swedenborgianism for providing a more accurate explanation of their system of healing than what Mesmer had offered. Both Mesmer and Swedenborg inspired in Hahnemann's disciples a decidedly mystical worldview, meaning the infusion of a spiritual energy into the inner recesses of each material body that worked in harmonious unison with the universe. Of the two, however, it was Swedenborg who held the strongest appeal. Now, when it comes to Swedenborg, it's really hard to comprehend the magnitude of his importance during the 18th and 19th centuries. Let us not forget that Emerson called the first half of the 19th century the age of Swedenborg, and listed him among the 6 most important representative men in the Western world. Swedenborg's grasp was such that he anticipated many of the 19th century breakthroughs in the fields of astronomy, metallurgy, magnetism, chemistry, atomic theory, and anatomy. Born in the age of the Enlightenment and trained on the books of extraordinary scholars, He not only mastered their worlds, but he introduced many new concepts. Trained in both the sciences and the humanities, he epitomized both the material and non-material side of the Enlightenment. For Swedenborg, the universe had both natural and spiritual qualities. We see this in his cosmology, where, like Mesmer, he projected an infinite something beyond the material universe. This something, this new energy source, Swedenborg called divine influx, or God's love. Mesmer's animal magnetism and Swedenborg's divine influx offered two competing energy sources for how homeopathic medicine worked, one secular and the other spiritual. But for those influenced by religion, it seems clear that there was a strong bond between homeopathy and Christianity, and in particular, Swedenborgian Christianity. In fact, by the second half of the 19th century, Swedenborgianism had replaced magnetism as the modus operandi for how dynamization took place. So who are some of the individuals who made a correlation between Swedenborg and homeopathy? Were they important people or were they insignificant people? Well, let me show you. The first was Hans Birch Graham of New York. He was the author of The Spirit of Homeopathic Healing, and he was the one who introduced homeopathy into America, and he did so in 1825. He was a devout member of the Church of the New Jerusalem, and he submitted that Swedenborgianism, more than materialistic mesmerism, formed the basis of what was the true healing power of homeopathy. Graham nurtured a loyal circle of disciples who met regularly to explore mesmerism, phrenology, psychology, and the spiritual levels of the soul. What enamored him was Swedenborg's explanation that disease was nothing more than evil and falseness that sapped away the health from the spiritual man. In other words, there was a close relationship between sin and disease. A second individual was Constantine Herring, the founder of the Allentown Academy in Pennsylvania, the first homeopathic school in the world. He too was a devout Swedenborgian and a member of the New Church in Philadelphia. He believed that the time was coming when the world of medicine would discover new insights and capacities as the result of Swedenborg's spiritual accomplishments. Then again, there was Charles Julius Hemphill, professor of materia medica and therapeutics at the Hahnemann Medical College of Philadelphia. He predicted, and I quote, "The day is fast approaching when the homeopathic profession will bow to Swedenborg as the great expounder of the philosophy of homeopathy," unquote. Hemphill translated a number of Hahnemann's writings, and what's interesting about him is he sought to clarify what he perceived to be inconsistencies in Hahnemann's system. And he published a book called Organon of Specific Homeopathy, in which he sought to improve upon homeopathic practice by introducing the Swedenborgian law of correspondences, meaning that everything that happened in the natural world had its counterpart in the spiritual world. He thus introduced the phrase correspondentia correspondentibus curantur as a substitute for Hahnemann's similia similibus curantur. By this he meant that there should be a perfect correspondence between the drug disease and the patient's spiritual condition. There was also Dr. James John Garth Wilkinson, a London homeopath who converted from regular medicine and was a close friend to Henry James Sr. and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Wilkinson wrote a biography of Swedenborg in 1849 and translated several of Swedenborg's books from Latin to English. According to Wilkinson, there was a direct relationship between the higher potencies that came with successive dilutions and the different levels of spirituality in humankind. Just as the Swedenborgians viewed the world as a gradual descent from the spiritual through a series of degrees to the visible and physical universe, the homeopath recognized disease as having a spiritual causation manifesting itself in corresponding sets of symptoms ranging from mild to serious. According to Wilkinson, the time was coming when the world of medicine would discover new insights as a result of Swedenborg's spiritualism and redeem the medical profession of its materialism, opening its mind to a more theological pathology. For a time, homeopaths actually spoke of Wilkinsonism, a term which clearly spoke to his influence in adding to the principles of Hahnemann. And finally, we have James Tyler Kent, who constructed a uniquely Swedenborgian approach to homeopathic medicine in his book Lectures on Homeopathic Philosophy, which he published in 1900. In it, he provided a full description of Swedenborgian philosophy, spelling out a human being's interior and exterior worlds, the influx from the interior to the external, and the dependency of the whole upon the divine. Born in 1849 in New York and raised as a Baptist, he matriculated at the Eclectic Medical Institute of Cincinnati and graduated in 1871. At the time, the Eclectic Medical Institute, or EMI, was one of the largest medical colleges in the country at the time, with a student population of nearly 400. I discovered, while I was writing the history of this medical school, that many of its faculty were devout Swedenborgians and members of the Church of the New Jerusalem, which happened to be just a block or two away from the school. And it was this discovery that led me to believe, to make the connection between Swedenborgianism and alternative medicine. Now, after graduating from EMI, Kent moved to St. Louis, where he began practicing medicine. And it was there that his wife became ill, and she requested to have a homeopathic physician tend to her. Impressed by the way his wife was able to recover from her illness, Kent decided to take a second medical degree at the Homeopathic Medical College of Missouri, and then, after graduating, joined the school's faculty. Now, beginning in the 1880s, and due principally to the influence of German clinical medicine, major changes were occurring across the medical landscape, forcing schools to refocus their energies on bacteriology, histology, pathology, embryology, microscopy, laboratory research, full-time faculty, lab instructors. Academic terms needed to be lengthened, and schools began requiring more than just 8 years of primary education, but now a high school and then even a college education. This change, and it was dramatic, resulted in a schism within homeopathy between its low and high potency groups. Low-potency homeopaths, who insisted on the less diluted medicines, were drawn during this time to a closer and closer relationship to conventional or allopathic medicine, laboratory-based science, and the desire of homeopathy to eventually become a specialty within conventional medicine. By contrast, the high-potency homeopaths, led by Kent, wanted nothing to do with conventional medicine. Drawn to ever higher potencies, he started at the 200th level and eventually ended into the millionths. Now, needless to say, once you get beyond the 30th, there is barely a molecule of the drug to be found in the solution. Following the death of his wife, he moved to Chicago, where he located his postgraduate school of homeopathic medicine that taught this form of high-potency medicine. Kentianism, which is what we call Kent's particular form of homeopathy, was built on 3 platforms. The first was Hemphill's belief that a fundamental correspondence existed between the material and the spiritual worlds. The second was Wilkinson's emphasis on the relationship between the higher potencies and the different levels of spirituality. And third, Swedenborg's concept of divine influx, which eventually affected the body's physical attributes. So what should we understand about Kentianism? What were its essential elements? Well, first and foremost, as a spiritual being, each individual's thoughts constituted the reigning principles of the soul. And when one's choices were drawn to inappropriate ends, the individual became sick in the will, and then from there to various physical ailments. So how does disease occur? When a person's spiritual interior was destroyed by lusts and passions, the exterior or material body suffered, leading to disease and, if not corrected, ultimately to death. Instead of disease being affected by changes in the body's material or molecular structures, it was affected instead by dynamic changes in the body's spiritual existence. Now, although Kent expected homeopaths to learn the structure of the physical body, the muscles, the nerves, the organs. It was not these parts, but the health of the soul that gave disease its human form. And so he condemned the experiments of microbiologist Robert Koch and French chemist Louis Pasteur, and insisted that bacteria were perfectly harmless in every respect. He believed that disease began before any hostile germ announced its existence in the body. Similarly, the autopsy room was no place to discover causes or remedies. Nothing, he said, was ever discovered by studying the dead. So what should we know about Kant's philosophy? Well, for one thing, it became the mainstay of homeopathy in the United States, and it also spread abroad, attracting Dr. Margaret Tyler and Sir John Weir in Great Britain, Pierre Schmidt in Germany, and Denis Demarque in France. It seems clear that Kantianism alienated more people than it converted, and hastened academic homeopathy's decline, rather than serving to revitalize it as Kant had hoped. While Kantianism provided an underpinning for homeopathic doctrines, it carried with it the attributes of religious belief and style that for many made Kant akin to that of a fundamentalist preacher, and less relevant to more progressive homeopaths, many of whom were trying to find an accommodation with conventional medicine. For progressive homeopaths, Kantianism became synonymous with Swedenborgianism, moving homeopathy further and further away from the rigors of modern science and laboratory-based medicine. For many, this meant that homeopathy could only be understood using the doctrines contained in Swedenborg's philosophy. Rather than treat the specific organ or lesion, Kant aimed his medicines at the patient's soul. In fact, he grouped his patients by type, which was nothing more than an echo of Swedenborg's characterization of the spiritual realms, where he described communities of angels gathered according to their personality and function to form the organs of a vast universal human that made up the whole of the heavens. Remember, too, that in his writing, Swedenborg characterized spirits, for example, as angels of the kidneys or angels of the lungs, ascribing these souls of the deceased with characteristics and functions that corresponded with those organs. Kantianism, according to its critics, paved the way for a New Age homeopathy that ignored physiological and organic medicine, replacing it with a faith-based system more attuned to the subtle vibrations emanating from the cosmos. Kantianism created a schism within homeopathy, particularly among those who considered such constitutional prescribing as contrary to Hahnemann's teachings. But Kantianism nevertheless attracted a new breed of homeopaths, whose preference was for a more spiritualized form of healing, as well as an antagonism toward organic processes that seemed too much aligned to a materialistic view of disease. Kant's combination of homeopathic and Swedenborgian thought became a dividing line between those homeopaths looking for physio-medical chemical changes and those intent on discovering degrees of matter and spirit in their remedies. As described by the French homeopath Denis Demarque, the Enlightenment of Kent has given homeopathy, the Anglo-Saxon world, the allure of a religious sect. In summary, the history of Kentian homeopathy has been the history of a metaphysical system of healing that demanded co-equal status with reductionist or conventional medicine. Believing that health and disease were attributes of a spirit source, clearly distinct from normative science, it claimed immunity from having itself judged by the double-blind, randomized clinical trial, which is the gold standard of evidence-based medicine. Kentianism was a form of soul therapy, whose individualized remedies were selected on the basis of a patient's emotional and physical characteristics and used to stimulate the body's defense system. Kent's methodology looks strikingly like phenomenology, in that he dismissed theories as abstract intellectualism and replaced them with a desire to observe the patient as a whole, directly and intuitively. For him, symbolism, revelations, intuition, and imagination were of much greater significance. And there you have it. For historians like myself, Kentianism fits into a broader context of neo-vitalist theories intended to oppose materialism and differentiate man from the rest of organic creation. Homeopathy's embrace of Swedenborgianism made its healing process into a more congenial, quasi-religious experience. And in doing so, it left unanswered the question of whether homeopathy would confront its identity. Would it make its future home in the double-blind clinical trials of reductionist medicine, which is what the low-potency homeopaths wanted? Or would it continue searching the universe for a paranormal explanation of its dynamized medicines? The answer depends on who you ask. Today, due in no small measure to Swedenborg's influence, homeopathy has become a bifurcated system of medicine. One faction looks wistfully at a more disciplined and reductionist process, seeking to fulfill a complementary role alongside mainstream medicine. The other, enthralled by a vision of the body's essential harmony with the unseen forces of the universe, has become little more than a faith-based system with beliefs and practices that are professed by a laity who have chosen to disregard the fundamental axioms of evidence-based medicine, as well as those axioms that formed the original foundation of Hahnemann's system of homeopathy. Thank you.